So just how big a role does China play across the African continent? Well, Beijing surpassed Washington as Africa's largest trading partner more than a decade ago. That relationship is worth around $200 billion a year in trade, according to China's Ministry of Commerce. Beijing is also financing power plants, roads and other infrastructure projects, handing out billions in loans each year to governments and state-owned entities across the continent. That's made China Africa's largest debt holder. The US has warned of Chinese debt traps that could see countries give up oil, minerals and land rights if they don't pay off their loans. Let's speak to political analyst and commentator on African affairs, Joseph Ochieno, who's with us live from London. Good to have you with us. Joseph, what do you make of Mike Pompeo's comments then? China's a dangerous influence on the African continent.
Adrian, that's rather rich. If China is a dangerous influence, then we can ask many questions. Who else is not? No, I think it is a cry which is rather unfortunate, rather almost hypocritical, isn't it? Pompeo talks about easy money. Now, if the Chinese money is not easy money, which one is? No, I think generally my concern would be that the US is realizing that they were playing games with Africa, but China came in fairly big. China comes with the minimum, if any, conditionalities, and the reality is that long-term China may beat the US and other nations on the African continent. My biggest concern, though, is, as the US President Barack Obama, former president that is, said, Africa's biggest challenge is lack of institutions. Had we on the continent had strong institutions, governments that are responsible and accountable, I think China would have been a very huge opportunity for the continent, particularly in the areas where China is at the moment, and that is investment in infrastructure, for which the continent is at a huge deficit. The issue is Chinese money, US money, in the profit motive and profit-driven global market today. Who provides you with the best deal? I think that's the issue. The issue then is that in the absence of basically a balancing act amongst African leaders, the Americans can actually shout at the moment and maybe hope that some of their allies will keep quiet.
But Pompeo does have a point, doesn't he, when he talks about corruption in Africa and undermining the rule of law. As to whether China is responsible for that, I suppose is debatable.
No, that's very true, except that corruption in Africa is not about deals with the Chinese companies. It's rather a general question of patronage and, as I said, lack of institutions, Adrian. Western companies have covered some of them, have been implicated in major corruption scandals on the African continent and patronage with African governments. I think that's the issue. I don't really think that the US can tell Africa that American companies, without detail, are necessarily the cleaner ones when it comes to the continent. Yes, there's big concern about the quality of Chinese investment beyond infrastructure and the manner in which Chinese companies, and in fact some of their personnel on the continent, treat and deal with Africans. I think that's a major concern. I've personally written some few pieces on this very particular matter. But generally, I think Africa is for grabs, unfortunately, and for me as an African, my concern is whether or not the opportunities that China offers, or the opportunities that now will emerge as a result of this apparent competition, is one in which African governments and African economic leaders are able to strategically pick and make the best deal for ordinary African peoples.
And what about this issue of debt? Pompeo calls it a Chinese debt trap. I mean, there are other countries in the world who've taken Chinese investment and found that they've lost control over those that infrastructure. Ports, for example, in Sri Lanka is one where China has got control of it because they couldn't repay the debt.
That's very real. I think that's very real and it's very, very true. Just over a decade ago, Jubilee 2000 came to the rescue of many African governments because of lack of institutional systems and because of corruption and lack of accountable and democratic governments, many of which governments in Africa anyway have been fueled and supported by the US until today. You know, we are back sort of seeming to the same spot, and on that one, I think China might be able to have a much more freer hand than the West. At least in the US or in London, you can walk in the streets and then the voters are able to influence their governments to simply say that, look, maybe let's have a debt relief. I don't know which way it will go for China. I think it's a very big risk for Africa that we're beginning to build a big amount of debt burden that, to me, I don't necessarily think that is necessarily going to be sustainable. Particularly the big risk is most of these debts, particularly because the loans are given to governments, most of whom don't have accounts, are not sufficiently accountable, with the exception, perhaps in a way, perhaps maybe Nigeria, ironically I would say so. Big recipients like Nigeria, South Africa, and Ethiopia. In South Africa they talk about government taking over, systems for which most of people are not able to very easily account to the ordinary citizenry.
Joseph, always good to talk to you. Many thanks indeed. Joseph Ochieno there in London.
Thanks for having me.